the get funded process. So basically, I learned from raising a number of rounds that a successful fundraise will follow a predictable pattern. There's a predictable steps and things that happen as you go through a successful fundraise. An unsuccessful fundraise can look 100 different ways, but a successful fundraise, they typically look the same. And I realized that there's a metaphor from nature that applies perfectly to raising money. And that's the metaphor of growing crops. And I'll explain this more in a minute. But essentially, here's the model. You got to prepare the soil, which is your internal preparation and your story, and getting very clear on what you're building, why you're building it, how you're going to build it, etc. Then planting is when you're actually preparing externally, like making your slides, making your investor lists, making your funnels. When the seeds are now planted, you move into watering, which is doing investor meetings and scanning for a lead investor. When you sign on your lead investor, then you can start harvesting the investor desire that you've been growing in the previous 3 steps. And when you've got more investor desire committed into your round, then you have size, space in your round, you move into closing. And the reason this metaphor works so well is because you, just like in growing crops, you can't skip a step when you're raising money. So if you skip planting, like you don't create a compelling deck and a compelling presentation, and you go and do investor meetings, you're unlikely to succeed. The same way that if you're growing crops and you don't plant the seeds, like you can't get mad that nothing's growing in the field. And if you want to be harvesting, but you haven't watered, well, you're not going to be able to do it when you're growing crops. And it's the same with investors. If you want to be closing everybody at the same time, but you haven't spent the time to do the meetings, get people excited, let them know what you're doing, and give them a timeline to commit to, then you're not going to be able to close them into your round. So it works beautifully. And it's also great for founders because you get to know, where am I? Am I in tilling? Am I in planting? Am I in watering? Am I in harvesting? Am I in closing? And if you're in planting, it's very clear what you need to be working on. If you're in watering, it's very clear what you need to be working on. If you're in harvesting, it's very clear what you need to be working on. And here's a more fleshed out version of this. So there's very specific demarcation points between each of the phases. Tilling ends when you get to certainty internally about how much you're raising, your values, who you're going to be raising by, and get a summary of your opportunity. Planting ends when all of your external materials, like your slides, your investor lists, your funnels, are all set up and ready to go. Watering ends when you sign on your lead investor. You're doing a whole bunch of meetings and watering, and it ends when you sign on that lead investor or first mover. Harvesting ends when you have more commitments in your round than you have space in your round. And then closing ends when you have cash in the bank and all the documents are signed. And in each of these phases, there's very specific things to be working on, and we'll break this down and support you through this process.